Chapter 9, Issues Concerning Police Conduct. Learning objectives. Explain police discretion and the continuum on which it exists. Understand the difference between discrimination and disparity and how they may account for disproportionality observed in the criminal justice system. Recognize when police are authorized to use force and the level and amount of force. List the least lethal options commonly available to law enforcement officers. Discuss if and when the use of deadly force is justifiable. Explain whether officers criminally charged in a use of force case retain their constitutional rights. Identify the key elements of police corruption. Describe the ways that police integrity can be enhanced and corruption reduced. So discretion, when you look at discretion, you're talking about the freedom of an agency or individual officer to choose to act or not. Low discretion versus high discretion. So individual officers have to be able to think on their feet, and they have to make split-second decisions, and they have discretion. And based upon their experience, training, and knowledge, they're supposed to be able to make the right type of decisions based upon that. Discrimination. Showing a preference in treating individuals or groups failing to treat equals equally. Just bottom line is this: treating one group of people different from the other. It could be race, creed, gender, sexual, male, female, all types, ethnicity, disparity. Simple difference, not necessarily caused by any kind of bias. Sometimes you can have a disparity where people are treated, let's just a simple difference, but it may not be necessarily due to bias. I'll give you an example. You may have a preference for being nicer to females than males, but you don't realize that. But the bottom line is females can be criminals too. Gender issues, differential treatment of men and women, police attitudes towards LGBT. So when you look at it, you have police officers are people. They come into it a lot of times with their own personal biases and stuff. And sometimes they can get in the way in how they deal with people, how they view about folks. If you grew up in a community and you was raised and it was reinforced that LGBTQ people are less than human or derelicts or whatever it may be, then that may be reflected in your attitude and how you treat them. Class issues, poor and more likely to come under police attention, lack of collective efficacy in poor neighborhoods. So sometimes you're treating people different. It can be classism. Because they come from poor and low income type places, you tend to view them as less than human or less than you and others. Racial issues. Perceived discrimination is a potential source of crime. Racial desperate arrest rates. So if you have someone working in the community and they actually have some personal issues about race that may be perceived, that may reflect in what they do. Racial disparate arrest rates. You live in a community, give you an example. A police officer could work in a community where it's 70% whites and 30% Hispanics. But the Hispanics are getting arrested. He arrests Hispanics 5 times more than he do the whites. Not saying that there aren't people that should be arrested, but that is an awful big disparity based upon the percentage of people who live there. Avoiding charges of racial profiling. Focus on behavior. People have a tendency sometimes, not intentional, but a lot of times to focus unnecessarily on race. A lot of times because it's somebody who is a different race than themselves. So they view them as suspicious because they are different. It's not the race that makes people commit the crime. It's the behavior that a police officer has to focus on. Watch what he says and watch what he does. His actions will let you know whether or not he's a criminal, not the color of his skin. Immigration issues, non-English speakers, reluctance to report crime, fear of police. So when you have a lot of people, when they come to this country, they come from other places where they do have corrupt governments and corrupt law enforcement. So they come here with a natural distrust of law enforcement. So they don't report crime. And sometimes it's difficult for them to speak with law enforcement because they don't speak English. Effects of federal law enforcement actions, confusion about whether and to what extent local law enforcement, local law and police enforce immigration laws, misunderstanding based on cultural differences, personal interactions that damage goodwill and trust. So When it comes to immigration laws, those are federal. Those are enforced by the federal law enforcement. You have some state and local law enforcement agencies that do have some type of agreements with federal law enforcement and others that do not. This can be confusing to people who are not from this country and they're here and they're immigrants about those. They have cultural differences. There's things that they value in their culture and there's things that they do that Americans may not traditionally value and Americans may not do. Subsequently, the law enforcement officer may not understand that. So use of force. Any physiological, or verbal contact between police officers and citizens. Most applications are low level. Gender and use of force. Females officers and are less likely to use excessive force or deadly force. Use of force continuums. Outdated concept. So when you look at the use of force, and this is basically when you determine the level of force that you need to get a job done, to de-escalate a situation. And most interactions, though, they're low because it's usually low-level type stuff. When you have gender and use of force, I'll give you an example. If a female officer gets into trying to arrest a guy, he's 6'4" and he's 230 and she's 5'7" and 160, and she ends up shooting him for fear of her life, she may have a justification for that. But if you're a male and you're 6 foot and you're 200 pounds, this guy only outweighs you by 30 pounds, only 2 or 3 inches taller than you, and you do the exact same thing, it may not be viewed the same way because realistically, you almost have two men who are of equal size and stature. So female officers are much likely to use excessive force because for one of the things, a lot of times females are dealing with men in the course of doing their job. So these men would actually be stronger than most of them. So they may be inclined to use their brain more so than their brawn to try to de-escalate a situation. So you have the use of force continuum. This is where you have situations where use of force, it determines. And basic rule of thumb in use of force is you can always go at one level on the use of force continuum to go one level above what the defendant or the suspect is doing to bring them down, to de-escalate. And so you do have a lot of outdated concepts out there where people are doing policing the way maybe they were taught 15, 20, and 30 years ago that may not work today because you're dealing with a different society and different generation of people. So you have to be able to adapt to that. Use of force part 2, sudden in custody death. So we've seen this before when we've had people who were apprehended and they were placed into custody and some of them died as a result of that. And in some of those instances, it was restraints that actually inhibited their breathing. Sometimes you have people who are drug users and they're amped up and you get into a physical altercation with them trying to arrest them. It gets their heart rate up and their blood pressure goes up. And these people may not have been possibly medicated. And then you can have someone to die from that. You have excited delirium death where people gets too excited in the course of what's going on between the altercation between them and law enforcement and accidentally die as a result. And then you have reasonable force no greater than what is needed to achieve desired end. So that is when you have, again, what I referred to earlier on the force continuum, when someone goes to one level, you can go one level above them to bring them down. But what you can't do is go up 5 or 6 levels on the continuum to try to bring them down. For instance, someone who's just being argumentative, you can't treat that as if there's somebody who made a threat to kill you. Excessive force, the application of amount or frequency of force greater than required to compel compliance from a willing subject. So when you have excessive force, this is what I just referred to. When you've done too much, you've gone too far. For instance, someone who's just arguing with you, you beat them, you pepper spray them, and then you threaten to shoot them before you arrest them. That's excessive. You didn't need to do that for somebody who's just arguing with you. Police brutality. Police brutality is when you have people, law enforcement officers, who've gone way beyond the call of duty. And when you've seen some of these things in the past, in this country and other countries where this has happened, where the police have actually done too much excessive force and accidentally killed someone. Less lethal force that has less potential for death or serious injury than the traditional tactics. So law enforcement should always be looking for the less lethal force whenever possible. The game plan is not to injure anybody. It's not to get injured or injure anybody. The game plan is, if you need to take someone in custody, to do that peaceful, without incident, and that person is not injured, not hurt, and neither is the officers involved. Restraints, aerosol, impact weapons, tasers. So these are the things that you'll find. You have all these different types of when it comes to use of force. Are you just restraining someone? Do you have the aerosols where we're actually using pepper spray? Yeah, impact weapons and that you can actually use, like the baton, and then tasers. All these are for different levels of use of force. And less lethal can still be fatal. It can still be fatal because a lot of things can factor in it. For instance, law enforcement officers don't have the luxury of knowing someone's health when they're trying to arrest them. If someone has some pre-existing medical conditions and you actually have to pepper spray them and use a taser on them, and they have a weak heart, it could happen right there. Deadly force, any force that it can be reasonably expected to cause death or serious bodily injury. So when you have someone who has a firearm, a weapon, or a pole, or anything that can be used as a weapon that can be used to cause death, this is when a law enforcement officer could actually use their weapon, their firearm. Even though the person only has a metal pipe in his hand, he can still kill people with a metal pipe. Law enforcement is authorized to use deadly force to stop the threat. Now, notice I didn't say they are authorized to kill it. They're authorized to stop the threat. And with that means, this question comes up a lot of times, why did the police officer shoot him so much? Well, basically what it should mean is the police officers had to shoot him so much because they had to shoot him that many times to stop the threat. Some people, you shoot them, they don't die. If you don't hit them just right in the right vital organ and stuff, they don't die. And depending upon how big they are, how amped up on drugs, it may take 4 or 5 or 6 times to shoot them before you actually stop. That will be why you continue to shoot. Taking life is a seizure which must be reasonable. So when you're looking to do this, you can justify the reason I stopped the threat and I killed this guy is he was threatening to kill these 2 little kids or whatever else. And that is reasonable. The contagious fire phenomenon. So when you have a fire in situations where you have usually involving arsonist type individuals, starts a fire somewhere else, one place, and it can get contagious, and you see them popping up in other places. When officers shoot, others have a proclivity to do also. So what you find sometimes, if you have a situation where an officer feels he or she needs to shoot because they think it's a life or death situation, or lethal force or deadly force is authorized, there are other officers who may be on the scene who did not hear the threat or see the threat, but they start shooting anyway. Extra shots are often involuntary reactions under stress rather than conscious motivation. So what they're talking about here is when you find a situation where police officers have shot 15, 16, 17 times, what they're saying is as a result of involuntary reactions, some of that happens because of being under distress. And usually when they're asked how many times, if they're interviewed after the fact and ask them, how many times did you shoot? They will respond with a number much lower, not because they're lying. Most of the time, it's because that's what they truly believe. And then when you go and look at the spent shells and see, when he says, well, I believe I shot 7 times, and you go and look at spent shell, find out he shot 17 times. This is what they're talking about. It was the stress that they were under at that time doing that. Avoid use of force related problems, emotional management, trying to be in a situation of your emotion, not only of you managing your own emotions, but trying to manage the emotions of other people when possible. And that way you can actually, if you could talk someone out of a serious situation versus having to use lethal force, that's the way you want to go. You have training. Law enforcement officers are usually required to go through training quarterly, at least 4 times a year, where they are qualifying with their weapons and they're doing use of force training. Officers' rights and use of force lawsuits, guarantee protection. Officers must be told that they retain their constitutional rights and that any information so provided cannot be used against if a criminal proceeding is brought against them. So when you have officers who are doing their job, and let's say that you have a situation where deadly force is used, they have protection and rights too in the course of doing their job. But In the event, if it's a situation where they view, well, I'll talk about this later if they go too far. But in the course of doing their jobs, they have protections so that they can do it, because sometimes law enforcement officers do have to use deadly force when it's justified. So police pursuits may cause not only significant property damage, but also result in injury or death of fleeing suspects, pursuing officers, and innocent standby. So when you look at police pursuits, let's talk about, for instance, with the vehicle. Someone is in a vehicle and they're speeding at a high rate of speed, and law enforcement officers are chasing them. This is a vehicle police pursuit. And there's always a possibility when you do that, that could result in the injury or death of not only the people, the bad guy, the suspect, or the law enforcement officers, but others who are not involved in it. They are dangerous by nature. What you find with some law enforcement agencies, they now have policies in place that says they do not do vehicle pursuits because of that. They must be controlled. If you're doing this, it has to be controlled. Bottom line is this: it has to become an operation type deal. Whereas people, you're on the radio, you're talking to other law enforcement officers, they're talking to you. Somebody is actually chiming on radio, giving information as what they see, and somebody's actually on the radio who's actually can be in command, make management decisions if necessary. High probability of damage to property and people. It's a high probability. When you see the cars, when they're fleeing from police, hitting other cars, maybe run over somebody on the sidewalk, but there's a high probability. The police policies that I was talking about. Every agency has its own policies about pursuit. And there's always an opportunity to disengage as an option. When if law enforcement officers are pursuing someone and they determine that this guy has just drove off the highway and rode through a park full of people and kids, law enforcement has the right to say, you know what, let's disengage. He's going through a park where pedestrians and children are playing at a high rate of speed. And if we pursue him, he's putting people in danger. And if we pursue him through that park in our vehicles, we're putting people in danger too. So when you look at civil liability, civil liberties, rights granted under 42 USC 1983. So everybody has rights to civil liberties, all people, whether you're civilians, whether you're law enforcement, the works, everybody has those rights. So when we look at litigophobia, this is something that pops into place because there was something that was happening back in the day that people would get sick or hurt, and then somebody would try to help them. And a lot of times that was a law enforcement officer. Well, if something went wrong, these people would turn around and sue the law enforcement officer, the agency, or people, and they were winning lawsuits. So what you found is a lot of people weren't covered. So now you have been laws been passed, like the Good Samaritan laws, that basically says that, if you're laying down on the road and you're sick and you're falling out and somebody's trying to help you, and if they're meaning well and there's no ill will or wanton endangerment, nothing crazy they do, you can't sue them. You have the Brady duty to disclose exculpatory evidence. This is basically says the prosecutors must, if they have evidence, they must turn over all evidence to the defense. If they have evidence that actually is beneficial to defense, they have to turn that over. If they do not, what you will find is in situations like that, cases can be dismissed. Lawsuits and SWATs. SWAT is the Special Weapons and Tactics Teams. These are people who do the high-risk search warrants and arrests, and high-risk entries and arrests. What you find with them, because they're high-risk and stuff, a lot of times they have to use a lot of different equipment, smoke bombs, kick doors in, windows, and things like that. But this says that they are not supposed to use excessive force and do excessive damage to people's property unnecessarily. So they should be doing just enough to do their jobs without going overboard. Reducing civil liability. When you talk to, there were studies done back in the day, and when they talk to a lot of police chiefs and executives about what can you do to reduce civil liability, some of the things they say is just, we need to get our officers just to be friendly to people, be nice, treat them decent, be respectful to folks. A lot of times that went a long way. If they did something wrong, apologize. It's not that big of a deal. It doesn't mean that you're less of a man. It makes you a bigger man to apologize, even if you're a police officer, if you made a mistake or something. having thorough incident reports, meaning there's an expression in law enforcement, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So nowadays you could probably say if it's not written down or recorded on audio and video, it didn't happen. So these incident reports back in the day, this is all you had on the side of the streets, or when police officers were talking to folks out and about, is their incident reports. So, you had to make sure that they were thorough. Now you have the body-worn cameras and stuff. This is part of the stuff now where bottom line is these things are engaged. Usually a police officer is supposed to engage them whenever they make contact with people to record what actually is said and what actually happens. So when you look at corruption, so back in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of corruption in law enforcement, and particularly in big cities like New York, Chicago, Miami, and places like that. And when it came to it, you saw all types of crimes that some of these police officers were even engaged in. I recall there's one incident in New Orleans where a female police officer who did off-duty security at a restaurant and another police officer who also did off-duty that she knew at the same restaurant, they rotated days. One day, this female police officer in New Orleans, who she was dating a drug dealer, a known drug dealer, her drug dealer boyfriend and them and some people and her decided to rob the restaurant where she worked off duty. Well, the night they went in there, her counterpart was working. Of course, he tried to stop him and they shoot and kill him. So when they talk about corruption, you've seen all types of corruption in law enforcement. There's been things put in place now to try to corral some of that and squash some of it and catch it and detect it early before things get out of control like that. One of the ways is actually better screening and taking into consideration the type of people you hire to bring into law enforcement. Misuse of authority for personal gain. So you have people who would misuse their authority for personal gain. For instance, you may have somebody like a law enforcement officer that tells a local grocery store owner, hey, if you give me free groceries every week, I'll make sure that nobody robs your store. I'll set aside and I'll protect your store or whatever else, as long as you give me some free groceries. He's using his job for misuse to gain something for his personal use. Key elements when you look at this type of stuff: conduct is prohibited by law or rule. Obviously, that is. Conduct involves misuse of the position. They're using it because if they didn't have the position, they would not be able to get these favors. Conduct involves a reward of personal gain for the officer. Like the example I just gave, he's getting free groceries. So ethics checks. How police learn about ethics checks. Is it legal? Is it balanced? How will it make me feel better about that? So when you look at ethics checks, you have law enforcement officers where you're looking at it to see if they're doing their job, to make sure they're doing their job. And when you have these, yes, they're legal. Is it balanced? Are you going about it the right way? Is this being something that's being above board, that's compliance with all the agency's policies and rules? How will it make me feel about myself? Well, when you are an ethical person and you are doing your job, most of the time, I've not heard those type of people complain about checks and balances. The people who a lot of times complain about that are people who might not be doing things right or who would want to do things wrong if you weren't checking on them. Honesty, honor, morality, allegiance, principled behavior, and dedication to the mission. So when you have people, this is what you want to have, hire the right type of people so that they have these elements. And when it comes to doing the job, these are the kind of people that will do the right type of job when it comes to it. And again, we're getting back with the Brady rules. We're talking about these individuals where they have rights and stuff too, but they're also bound by codes of ethics. Impeachment of prosecution witnesses. This happens when you have individuals who they've lied to a police officer and law enforcement is using them as a witness. And realistically, the defense can prove that they lied. So they impeach the witness. So give you an example. If a guy robs a store and I actually was walking down it and then I said, well, I saw a guy running, but police asked me, can I identify the guy? I was too far away, but I tell them, yes, I can identify him and go to a police lineup and I pick out a guy and say, that was the one who did it. Well, realistically, they go back and look at the cameras and they see that I was so far away. The defense found camera to show that I was so far away that there was no way I could have saw some of the things that I was describing about this guy, like how his face actually looked, that he had facial hair, because I was 3 blocks away. So what they did is they just impeached me as a witness. Basically, my word means nothing anymore from that point forward. So building the ethical department, the application selection process. How are you hiring people? What type of people are you hiring? Are you hiring high moral people? If you're hiring shady people, I can show you people who's going to do shady things when they get on the job. Consistent reinforcement of the values through training and professionalism. You have to have ongoing training to remind people what it is they're supposed to be doing and what they're not supposed to be doing. Anti-corruption posture of checks and balances. You got to have checks and balances. Like, for instance, some of the things you'll find with some police departments, kind of like the military, they do periodic drug tests of their officers. They do things like that to ensure that they don't have people who are actually using drugs illegally carrying a badge and gun. And then you have internal affairs investigations. This is when you have allocations of misconduct by law enforcement officers. This is the police who police the police. And so they do operations and they do internal affairs investigations on officers where things have been alleged to be wrong, illegal, or fraudulent. That concludes this chapter.